Yeah, they said I was too old to understand stocks, but I made $2 million before their wedding weekend. And let me tell you, proving them wrong was sweeter than any revenge I could have ever imagined.
My mother was always strong, but this changed everything. She proved it's never too late.
My name is Victoria, and at 62 years old, I thought I had seen it all. I had raised 3 kids as a single mother after my husband left us when the youngest was only 5. I had worked double shifts at the diner, saved every penny I could, and somehow managed to put all 3 of my children through college. I thought my biggest challenges were behind me, that my golden years would be filled with grandchildren's laughter and quiet Sunday afternoons. Boy, was I wrong. It all started when my youngest son, Michael, announced he was getting married. I was thrilled, of course. Sarah seemed like a lovely girl, and Michael had never been happier. But from the moment I met Sarah's parents, Richard and Patricia Whitmore, I knew there was going to be trouble. They were old money, the kind of people who had never worked a day in their lives, but somehow felt entitled to look down on everyone else. The first time we met was at a fancy restaurant in downtown Chicago. I had driven 3 hours from my small town in Illinois, wearing my best dress, a navy blue number I had bought on sale at JCPenney 2 years earlier. The moment I walked into that restaurant, I felt underdressed. Patricia was dripping in diamonds, and Richard wore a suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months at the diner. "So, Victoria," Richard said after we had ordered, his voice dripping with condescension, "what do you do for work?" "I'm a waitress at Miller's Diner," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Been there for 28 years. Patricia nearly choked on her wine. "A waitress? How quaint." The conversation went downhill from there. They talked about their vacation home in the Hamptons, their yacht, their country club. They asked about my investment portfolio and laughed when I mentioned my savings account at the local credit union. But the moment that really got to me was when Richard leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, Victoria, I suppose at your age, you wouldn't understand the complexities of the stock market anyway. It's probably better that you stick to simple savings accounts." Sarah looked mortified, and Michael's face turned red with anger, but I just smiled and nodded. Inside, though, I was seething. Not because they were wealthy. I had no problem with people who had money. It was their assumption that because I was older, because I was a waitress, because I shopped at JCPenney instead of Nordstrom, that I was somehow less intelligent, less capable. That night, I drove home in silence, their words echoing in my head. Too old to understand stocks. I was 62, not 92. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I had managed to raise 3 kids on a waitress's salary, had balanced budgets that would have made a CPA proud, had made financial decisions that had gotten all of us through some very tough times. But because I had never had enough money to invest in the stock market, I was somehow too old and too stupid to understand it. When I got home that night, I did something I had never done before. I opened my laptop, the one Michael had bought me for Christmas 2 years earlier that I mostly used for email and Facebook, and I started researching. I stayed up until 3 in the morning reading about stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and something called day trading. I didn't understand most of it, but I was determined to learn. The next day, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. I spent the entire day at the public library, reading books about investing, taking notes like I was back in school. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, who had known me for years, was curious about my sudden interest in finance. "Planning for retirement, Victoria?" she asked. "Something like that," I replied, not wanting to explain the real reason. For the next 2 weeks, I immersed myself in learning everything I could about the stock market. I watched YouTube videos, read blogs, joined online forums. I learned about P/E ratios, market caps, dividend yields. I studied charts and graphs until my eyes burned. I practiced with virtual trading platforms, making fake investments with pretend money. The more I learned, the more fascinated I became. The stock market wasn't some mysterious entity that only wealthy people could understand. It was a system with patterns and logic. It was like reading people, something I had gotten very good at during my years as a waitress. You learn to read body language, to anticipate needs, to understand what someone wants before they even ask for it. The market had its own language, its own tells. But I also realized that I needed more than just knowledge. I needed capital. I had about $15,000 in my savings account, my entire life savings. It wasn't much by Richard and Patricia's standards, but it was everything I had, and I was about to risk it all. I remember the day I opened my trading account. My hands were shaking as I transferred the money from my savings to the brokerage account. This wasn't just money, it was security. It was my backup plan if I got sick, my emergency fund if the car broke down. But it was also my chance to prove that I wasn't too old, too poor, or too stupid to succeed. My first investment was in a small biotech company that was developing a new diabetes medication. I had done weeks of research, reading everything I could find about the company, their trials, their competition. I invested $2,000 and watched nervously as the stock price fluctuated throughout the day. Within a week, the stock had gained 20%. I had made $400. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was proof of concept. I could do this. But I also learned my first hard lesson just as quickly. My second investment, in a tech startup that I thought was the next big thing, lost 30% of its value in 2 days. I watched $600 disappear and felt sick to my stomach. I called Michael that night, almost ready to give up. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked. "You sound terrible." "I'm fine, honey." "Just tired." "Are you sure you've been acting strange lately?" "Sarah said you seemed distracted at dinner last week." I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't. Not yet. If I failed, if I lost all my money, I didn't want him to know that his mother had been such a fool. Instead, I went back to studying. I read about risk management, about diversification, about not putting all your eggs in one basket. I learned about stop-loss orders and position sizing. I realized that investing wasn't just about picking the right stocks. It was about managing risk, about having a system. Over the next few months, I developed my own strategy. I focused on companies I could understand and industries I had some knowledge of. I invested in restaurant chains because I understood the food service industry. I bought shares in retail companies because I was a consumer and could see which ones were thriving and which were struggling. I invested in pharmaceutical companies because I had watched my own parents age and knew that healthcare was only going to become more important as baby boomers got older. I also learned to control my emotions. The first few times I lost money, I panicked. I sold too quickly when stocks went down and held on too long when they went up. But gradually, I learned to stick to my system, to buy when others were selling, to take profits when stocks reached my target prices. By Christmas, 6 months after that dinner with the Whitmores, I had turned my $15,000 into $32,000. I had more than doubled my money. But I didn't tell anyone. I kept going to work at the diner, kept living in my small apartment, kept driving my old Honda Civic. The only difference was that I spent my break times checking stock prices on my phone instead of reading magazines. Michael and Sarah's wedding was scheduled for June, exactly 1 year after that first disastrous dinner. As the date approached, the Whitmores became more and more involved in the planning. They insisted on paying for everything, which I was grateful for since I couldn't afford a wedding at the country club they had chosen. But they also made it clear, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that I was expected to stay in the background. "We've arranged for you to sit at table 12, Patricia told me during one of the planning meetings. "It's in the back so you won't feel overwhelmed by all the sophistication." "That's very thoughtful," I replied, biting my tongue. "And we've taken care of your outfit," she continued, sliding a box across the table. "We can't have you showing up in something inappropriate." Inside the box was a beige dress that looked like something a grandmother would wear to church. It was the kind of dress that said invisible and unimportant. I thanked her politely and took the box home, where I hung the dress in my closet and forgot about it. Because by then, something amazing was happening with my investments. The pharmaceutical stock I had bought early on had just announced breakthrough results in their clinical trials. The stock price tripled overnight. My restaurant chain investments were performing well as the economy recovered and people started dining out more. Even some of my riskier tech plays were paying off. By April, my portfolio was worth over $400,000. I remember the day I first saw that number on my screen. I stared at it for 10 minutes, convinced it was a mistake. I logged out and logged back in 3 times, but the number was still there. I had turned $15,000 into $400,000 in less than 10 months, but I wasn't done. I had learned that the key to really big gains was patience and compound growth. Instead of taking profits, I reinvested everything. I diversified into international markets, bought into emerging technologies, invested in renewable energy companies that I believed would be the future. The Whitmores, meanwhile, continued to treat me like I was invisible. At the rehearsal dinner, Richard made a toast about how proud he was that his daughter was marrying into such a stable middle-class family. The way he said middle class made it sound like a disease. "Michael comes from humble beginnings," he said, looking directly at me. "But we're confident that with Sarah's influence and our guidance, he'll be able to provide a comfortable life for our daughter." I smiled and applauded along with everyone else, but inside I was counting the days until I could wipe that smug look off his face. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5 a.m. and checked my portfolio. The number on the screen made my heart skip a beat. $1,800,000. I was almost at $2 million, almost. I had been watching a particular stock for weeks. A small biotech company that was scheduled to announce FDA approval results for their new cancer drug that Friday morning. The wedding was on Saturday. If the results were positive, the stock would skyrocket. If they were negative, it would crash. It was a huge gamble, but I had done my research. The drug had performed exceptionally well in trials, and there were rumors that the FDA was fast-tracking the approval process. I made the biggest bet of my life. I put $400,000, 20% of my entire portfolio, into that one stock. At 9 a.m., the announcement came: FDA approval. The stock price jumped 60% in the first hour of trading. By the time the market closed on Friday, my $400,000 investment was worth $680,000. My total portfolio value, $2,160,000. I had done it. I had made over $2 million in less than a year. That Saturday morning, as I was getting ready for the wedding, I looked at the beige dress Patricia had given me, still hanging in my closet with the tags on. Then I looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time in months, I really looked at myself. I was 63 years old. I had worked my entire life. I had raised 3 children on my own. And I had just proven that I was smarter and more capable than people half my age who had been handed everything on a silver platter. I drove to the mall and bought a new dress. Not a beige, invisible grandmother dress. A stunning navy blue cocktail dress that fit me perfectly and made me feel like $1 million, which I realized with a smile I literally was. The wedding ceremony was beautiful. Michael looked handsome in his tuxedo, and Sarah was radiant in her $1,000 dress. I sat in the back at table 12 as assigned, but I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt powerful. The reception was held in the country club's grand ballroom. There were ice sculptures and champagne fountains, and a 12-piece orchestra. It was the kind of event that was designed to show off wealth and status. The Whitmores worked the room like politicians, introducing Sarah to their friends and business associates, making sure everyone knew that this was their show. I had been sitting quietly at my table, chatting with some of Michael's friends from college, when Richard approached with a group of his golf buddies. "Gentlemen," he said loudly, clearly having had a few drinks, "I'd like you to meet the mother of the groom, Victoria. She's a waitress." The men looked at me with polite but dismissive smiles. I could see them thinking the same thing Richard had thought a year ago. Poor, simple, beneath their notice. "How interesting," one of them said with fake enthusiasm. "And what restaurant do you work at?" "Actually," I said, standing up and smoothing my dress, "I've recently made some career changes." Richard laughed. "Career changes? At your age? What, did you switch from the breakfast shift to the dinner shift?" The men chuckled at his joke. I smiled sweetly. "No, Richard, I've become an investor." "An investor?" Patricia had appeared beside her husband, having overheard the conversation. "Victoria, that's wonderful. Did you put some money into a CD at the bank? Or maybe a mutual fund?" "Something like that," I replied. "How much?" Richard asked, his voice still condescending. "A few $1,000s. "That's cute, Victoria. But that's not really investing. That's just savings with a fancy name. The group was watching our exchange with interest now. Other conversations had quieted as people sensed drama. Well, I said, pulling out my phone. Let me check my portfolio balance. I opened my trading app and turned the screen toward them. The number was clearly visible. $2,164,847.23. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went pale. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The golf buddies stared at the screen, then at me, then at each other. That can't be right, Richard stammered. That's over $2 million. $2.16 million, to be exact, I said calmly. I started with $15,000 11 months ago. Right after our first dinner together, actually. You remember, don't you, Richard? When you said I was too old to understand stocks? Patricia grabbed the phone from my hands and stared at the screen. This is fake. This has to be fake. I took the phone back and opened my trading history, showing them my transactions, my gains, my current holdings. The evidence was undeniable. How? Richard asked weakly. Well, I said, enjoying every moment of this. It turns out that understanding people, which you learn after 28 years of waiting tables, is actually quite useful in understanding markets. And it turns out that being older means having patience, which is essential for long-term investing. Oh, and it turns out that not having everything handed to you on a silver platter means you actually pay attention when you're risking your own money. By now, half the reception was listening to our conversation. Michael had noticed the commotion and was making his way over, looking concerned. Mom, what's going on? He asked. I turned to my son and smiled. I was just sharing some news with the Whitmores, honey. It turns out your old mom has been quite busy this year. I showed Michael the phone. His eyes widened, and for a moment I thought he was going to faint. Mom, is this real? It's real, sweetheart. You made $2 million in less than a year? How? I learned something new, I said, looking directly at Richard. Turns out you're never too old to learn, and you're never too poor to succeed if you're willing to work for it. The crowd that had gathered around us was buzzing with excitement. I could hear whispered conversations. $2 million? In 11 months? She's a waitress. How is that possible? Richard looked like he wanted to disappear. Patricia was frantically whispering to some of her friends, probably trying to do damage control. Their moment of superiority had evaporated completely. But the best part wasn't their humiliation. It was the look on Michael's face. Pure pride and amazement. He hugged me tightly. Mom, I'm so proud of you. Not because of the money, but because you never gave up. Even when people doubted you. Sarah appeared beside us, having heard the commotion. When Michael explained what had happened, she looked mortified. Victoria, I'm so sorry about my parents. They had no right to treat you that way. Don't apologize for them, honey, I said. Their behavior says everything about them and nothing about you. You're a wonderful girl, and I'm thrilled to have you as a daughter-in-law. The rest of the evening was surreal. People who had ignored me all night were suddenly very interested in talking to me. Men who had dismissed me as just a waitress wanted to know my investment strategies. Women who had looked down on my JCPenney dresses were asking where I bought my stunning outfit. I answered their questions politely but briefly. I wasn't interested in their sudden attention. I was interested in celebrating my son's wedding and enjoying the moment I had worked so hard for. Later that night, as the reception was winding down, Richard approached me at the bar. He looked defeated. Victoria, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Richard. No, I do. I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. Yes, you were. But the truth is, you weren't wrong because you misjudged my intelligence or my capabilities. You were wrong because you judged me at all. You looked at my job, my clothes, my background, and you decided you knew everything about me. That was your mistake. He nodded slowly. How did you do it? Really? I thought about his question for a moment. How had I done it? It wasn't just the research, though that was important. It wasn't just the strategy, though that mattered too. It was something deeper than that. I did it because you told me I couldn't, I said finally. When someone tells you that you're too old, too poor, too whatever to achieve something, you have two choices. You can believe them, or you can prove them wrong. I chose to prove you wrong. And you did, he said quietly. Yes, I did. The next morning, I drove home to my small apartment above the garage. I looked around at my simple furniture, my small kitchen, my secondhand belongings. Nothing had changed physically, but everything felt different. I was still the same person, but I was also completely transformed. I thought about what I wanted to do with my new wealth. I could buy a big house, a fancy car, expensive clothes. I could quit my job at the diner and never work again. But those things didn't appeal to me as much as I thought they would. Instead, I decided to keep working, at least for now. I loved the diner, loved the regular customers, loved the routine. But I also decided to start a scholarship fund for kids from working-class families who wanted to go to college but couldn't afford it. I knew what it was like to struggle financially, and I wanted to help others who were facing the same challenges I had faced when my kids were young. I also decided to start teaching investing classes at the community center. There were probably dozens of people in my town who felt the same way I had felt a year earlier, intimidated by the stock market, convinced it was only for wealthy people. I wanted to show them that with education and patience, anyone could learn to invest successfully. Most importantly, I learned something about myself that I hadn't realized before. I had always defined myself by my limitations, my age, my job, my income, but those weren't limitations at all. They were just circumstances. What mattered was what I did with those circumstances. I also learned that the best revenge isn't plotting against the people who wrong you. The best revenge is succeeding so completely that their opinions become irrelevant. Richard and Patricia's opinion of me had hurt because, on some level, I had believed they might be right. But once I proved to myself that they were wrong, their opinion stopped mattering. 6 months after the wedding, Michael called to tell me that Sarah was pregnant. I was going to be a grandmother. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my grandchild would grow up knowing that their grandmother was someone who had overcome challenges, who had learned new things even in her 60s, who had turned $15,000 into millions through determination and hard work. That legacy, the knowledge that you can reinvent yourself at any age, that you can learn new skills, that you can prove doubters wrong, was worth more than all the money in my portfolio. And speaking of my portfolio, it's now worth over $3 million. I've continued investing, continued learning, continued growing my wealth. But more than that, I've continued growing as a person. The girl at the bank who used to process my small deposits now handles my investment transfers with wide eyes and a respectful, "Yes, ma'am." The manager who used to barely acknowledge me now calls me personally to discuss new investment products. But their change in attitude doesn't matter to me anymore because I no longer need their validation. I still live in the same apartment, still drive the same Honda Civic, still work at Miller's Diner 3 days a week. My coworkers know about my success now. News travels fast in a small town, but they treat me the same as always. That's one of the things I love about working-class people. They judge you by who you are, not what you have. Last month, I got a letter from a young woman named Jessica who had heard about my story through the local newspaper. She was 25, a single mother working 2 jobs, trying to save money for her daughter's college fund. She asked if I would mentor her, teach her about investing. I met Jessica at the coffee shop downtown. She reminded me of myself 30 years ago. Tired but determined, struggling but hopeful. I gave her some books to read, helped her open a trading account, walked her through her first investment. She started with $500, which was all she could afford. 3 months later, that $500 had grown to $800. She called me, crying with joy. "Victoria, I did it. I made money in the stock market." "I never thought someone like me could do this." "Someone like you?" I asked. "You know, young, poor, uneducated about this stuff." I laughed, remembering a similar conversation I'd had with myself just 2 years earlier. "Jessica, honey, there's no someone like you when it comes to investing. There are only people who are willing to learn and people who aren't. Age doesn't matter. Background doesn't matter. What matters is that you're willing to educate yourself and take calculated risks." Today, Jessica's portfolio is worth over $15,000. She's quit one of her jobs and is taking night classes to become a financial advisor. She wants to help other single mothers learn about investing. That's the thing about success. It's contagious. When you prove that something is possible, you give other people permission to try it themselves. I've been thinking lately about what I want to do next. At 64, I'm certainly not done achieving things. I've been considering writing a book about my experience, maybe starting an investment club for seniors, possibly even running for town council. Age, I've learned, is just a number. What matters is what you do with the time you have. The other day, I ran into Patricia at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me, probably remembering our last encounter at the wedding. But I smiled and asked about Sarah and the baby. "They're doing well," she said stiffly. "Sarah's due date is next month." "I'm so excited to be a grandmother," I said. "I've already started a college fund for the baby." "That's nice," she replied, clearly not knowing what to say. "I put $50,000 in it to start," I added casually, watching her eyes widen. "Figure by the time the baby's 18, it should be worth enough to pay for any college they want to attend." Patricia looked like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Finally, she managed, "That's very generous." "Family is everything," I said. "I want to make sure this baby has every opportunity in life." As I walked away, I could feel her watching me. I'm sure she was thinking about that dinner 2 years ago, about her husband's comment about me being too old to understand stocks. I'm sure she was calculating how much my portfolio might be worth now. But her thoughts don't matter to me anymore. What matters is that I've proven to myself that I can do anything I set my mind to. What matters is that I've created a legacy for my family. What matters is that I've shown other people, like Jessica, that success isn't reserved for the young or the wealthy or the well-connected. The truth is, they were right about one thing. I didn't understand stocks when this all started. I was ignorant about investing, intimidated by financial markets, convinced that such things were beyond my reach. But being ignorant isn't the same as being incapable of learning. Being old isn't the same as being unable to grow. The difference between successful people and unsuccessful people isn't intelligence or luck or even opportunity. It's the willingness to prove the doubters wrong, starting with the biggest doubter of all, yourself. So, yes, they said I was too old to understand stocks. And yes, I made $2 million before their wedding weekend. But the real victory wasn't the money. The real victory was discovering that at any age, at any stage of life, you can still surprise yourself with what you're capable of achieving. And that discovery, more than any amount of money, has made me rich beyond measure.